It's interesting because they're such a common find, but we actually don't really know that much about them, especially in terms of the details.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fie de Wit. We continue our journey along Sint Eustatius' historical timeline, arriving between the years 1650 and 1700s. In this episode, The Curse and the Magic of the Blue Bead, we enter a new and intricate chapter of the island's past. Here, we'll take a closer look at the mysterious blue bead, an object often whispered about in legends and folklore. And we'll examine its profound cultural, economic, and symbolic significance. But before we begin, an important disclaimer. The stories we continue to share include the harsh realities of enslavement, and at times, discussions of sexual violence. These truths are unsettling and may stir deep emotions. We do not recount them to cause harm, but to confront long-hidden chapters of history. By speaking openly and sincerely, we seek to honor these individuals, especially women, who bore these injustices with unimaginable resilience. During this era, countless women, men, and children on Sint Eustatius lived beneath the crushing weight of enslavement. And for women in particular, this burden was compounded by physical, emotional, and sexual violence. These are painful realities to acknowledge, yet they must be spoken about if we wish to see, hear, and remember all sides of history. As the saying goes, mold grows in dark places, and by shining a light on this darkness, we can prevent it from festering and begin to lift some of the heaviness and inspire transgenerational collective healing. As we acknowledge these truths, it's important to remember that Sint Eustatius did not exist in isolation. The hardships endured here were part of a larger pattern. They were woven into the economic, political, and cultural tides that swept across the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. To understand why a single blue bead could hold such a deep meaning, we must first broaden our perspective and situate the island and its people within the wider currents that shape their reality. Historian and teacher Dr. Allain will guide us through these broader historical landscapes, helping us place Sint Eustatius within the larger tapestry of forces at play during this pivotal period.
So this is an extremely important period in the history of Atlantic slavery because it marked the beginning of the legal codification of matrilineal inheritance of slave status. In 1662, the colony of Virginia, which was part of the British Empire, enacted a law that said children would inherit their mother's status as either free or enslaved. So the name of this doctrine was Partus Sequitur Ventrum, that's Latin, and the translation is offspring follows belly. The legal roots of this doctrine are actually really complicated, and there's a fair amount of debate and discussion as to how much Partus Sequitur Ventrum either broke with or, on the contrary, was an inheritance of Roman slave law. And in my bibliography that I provided, I reference a few historians who kind of explore the roots of this doctrine. But regardless, for our purposes, the most important thing to know is that the 1662 passage of this law set a precedent among all Atlantic slaveholding systems, or at least all American slaveholding systems, that inheritance of slave status would be passed from mothers to children. For enslaved women, knowing that their bodies gestated slavery shaped their experience of slavery on a really core level. It was really important for Europeans to sort of cast Black women as inherently animalistic so that the justification for enslaving them and their children was more overt. European writers who traveled to Africa and who were sort of invested in the racial apparatus of slavery started writing and talking about enslaved women in increasingly animalizing and dehumanizing ways to sort of make the ideological separation between African women who were enslavable and white women who were not enslavable, right? So we start to see the descriptions of African women become more racist, more kind of violent as slave labor becomes in higher demand.
Enslaved women faced a unique set of horrors, including sexual violence, which was both a tool of power and a method of control. Many women bore children who inherited their enslaved status through the doctrine, the child follows the belly. This legal principle meant that enslaved women's bodies became sites of exploitation, perpetuating generational enslavement. This violence wasn't confined to women alone. Men also faced sexual abuse, often as a form of punishment. However, enslaved women's proximity to plantation households exposed them to daily physical and psychological abuse. The legacies of these traumas continue to ripple through generations. Dr. Allain shows us how deeply enslavement reached into every aspect of life, shaping identities before birth and positioning women's bodies as vessels of oppression. Sexual violence, though certainly not exclusive to women, weighed especially heavy on them, leaving scars that echoes through generations. To understand how these brutal realities translated into everyday life, we need to consider the roles and expectations placed upon enslaved individuals. Who was permitted to learn a trade, to oversee others, or move with relative freedom, or even limited? And who was confined to grueling labor or domestic servitude with no refuge from violence and control? By examining these distinctions between men and women's experiences, we'll gain a clearer view of how deeply gender influenced every facet of enslavement. Dr. Allain will now continue to shed light on these crucial differences, guiding us further into the complex hierarchies that shape people's lives across the Caribbean.
Another difference between the experiences of enslaved women and enslaved men has to do with sexual violence. I just want to say, I think it would be wrong to assume that enslaved men didn't experience sexual violence. We don't have a ton of archival evidence of this, but knowing what we know about how violence was such an everyday feature of Caribbean slavery, I suspect that men were victims of sexual abuse more than we know about. However, as in Caribbean slave societies, were societies in which women were especially vulnerable to sexual violence.
As Dr. Allain explains, the laws and perceptions that emerged during this period did more than define who was enslaved. They shaped the core of how an individual were seen, treated, and valued. Within this world, gender added another complex layer to the already oppressive structures of enslavement. To understand the lived realities of those here on St. Eustatius, we must consider how these overlapping systems affected both women and men, often in distinct and deeply unjust ways. How did these societal frameworks translate into daily life for the enslaved individuals? Which roles could they access, and which spaces were they forced to occupy? And most importantly, how did women and men's experience differ beneath the weight of these harsh hierarchies? By examining the difference in their labor, status, and vulnerability, we gain a clearer sense of how power and violence shaped every aspect of their existence. Dr. Allain will continue to elaborate on these insights as we explore these crucial distinctions.
One major difference between the experiences of enslaved women and enslaved men has to do with the kind of work they did. So Caribbean plantations were very hierarchical. White people were on top, but even among the enslaved, there was a hierarchy. And enslaved men had much greater access than enslaved women to particular roles that afforded them a higher status. For example, some men worked as slave drivers, which meant that they oversaw and disciplined enslaved laborers as they worked. And this is not a role that women generally had access to. Enslaved men also had access to certain skilled trades, such as blacksmithing. And in the French Caribbean, enslaved men also had access to the position of chef. And this again offered them more authority and status. One exception I can think of is that in the French Caribbean, enslaved women sometimes held nursing roles in plantation hospitals, and this was a fairly privileged position. While the majority of enslaved women worked in the fields alongside men, and in fact, in certain parts of the Caribbean, at certain junctures, women actually outnumbered men among those who worked in the fields. A small number of women worked as domestics within plantation households. And there's this sort of longstanding myth that enslaved domestics had easy lives or were in cahoots with slaveholders. And household work was indeed easier on the body than harvesting sugarcane, because harvesting sugarcane was notoriously just incredibly physically taxing. But one of the downsides to working in plantation households was that it placed enslaved women in close proximity to slaveholders, and this exposed them to extreme daily violence, physical violence, sexual violence, and psychological torture. There's a book called Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, that describes this in the context of the United States. And I think the same thesis kind of holds true for the Caribbean.
Dr. Allain's words paint a troubling picture. Even in the roles considered more privileged than field work, enslaved women were not separated from brutality. Proximity to the enslaver's household meant proximity to profound emotional and physical harm. What seemed less taxing on the body often proved more harrowing for the spirit. This stark truth leaves no illusion. There was no safe haven from the oppressive grip of enslavement, and any appearance of comfort came at an unforgiving cost. These insights reminds us that the reach of enslavement and the cruelty it fueled stretch far beyond a single place. To understand how they took root here on St. Eustatius specifically, we must now return to the island's own narrative, one shaped by distant trade routes and imperial ambitions, yet formed by the very people who built its warehouses, worked its fields, and sailed its shores. We now turn to Mrs. Soutekouw, a longtime resident and founding member of the island's Archaeological Research Center. She will help guide us from the broad regional picture into the tangible changes unfolding here on St. Eustatius.
After the war with France in 1650, Eustatius belonged to the Dutch, was raided several times by other people. But the Dutch began to establish, they first started raising crops. They actually raised tobacco, and they started raising sugarcane. And we were exporting those. They started building warehouses on the waterfront. By 1700, there were already 20 warehouses on the waterfront. Those warehouses were exporting product. It was the beginning of the actual trade of product to and from station.
As Mrs. Soutekouw explains, by the dawn of the 18th century, St. Eustatius was evolving into more than a distant colonial outpost. It was becoming a thriving center of commerce. Warehouses lined the waterfront, enabling a steady flow of goods in and out. Yet, trade isn't defined by infrastructure alone. It's shaped by the objects exchanged, the values they carry, and the human stories woven through them. To understand how a seemingly humble glass bead could embed itself so deeply into this island's story, we now turn to archaeologist Dr. Zahidi. Having previously lived and worked here on St. Eustatius, Dr. Zahidi has extensively researched the island's blue beads. Specializing in post-colonial community heritage, she brings valuable insight into their origins, significance, and the method used to create them, starting with the exploration of what these beads looked like and how they were produced.
So then they started producing these beads in different parts of the Netherlands. There were a couple of factories in Amsterdam, and there were also several factories in Bavaria. But then when the beads came to Statia, they were kind of entangled in this economy of enslaved people on the island. So the beads were made in a few different ways. There's two main types. One is called a furnace wound bead, where you would take a rod and then take a piece of essentially glass thread and wind it around the rod to make the shape of the bead. So when you find those big round beads that kind of have those very fine lines and crevices in them, those are wound beads. The 5-sided blue beads that we find on Statia are pulled beads. And so you would have a long rod of glass and then divide it into pieces and shape it. And so sometimes when you find those 5-sided beads, you'll find a double bead. And that means that bead wasn't broken at the line where it was supposed to be broken. It just stayed a double bead. So those are the main types. In terms of the 5-sided beads that we see on Statia, we call it the Statia bead. They are found in an unusually high concentration on Statia, but they're not only found on Statia. Unfortunately, with a lot of these histories that are tied to enslavement, we don't really have a lot of information apart from what we find in the archaeological record and from oral histories. Blue beads aren't really written about that much in the archives, and that's why oral histories are so important. As for why so many are on Statia, we don't really know. It seems pretty clear that Blue Bead Hole was a shipwreck site because we find ballast stones at Blue Bead Hole and a high concentration of Statia beads. It's possible that for a period that they were being produced, that was a time when there was a lot of trading happening in Statia, and many rounds of those beads were brought to Statia, and that's what we find now. But there's so much to learn about them.
The underwater site Dr. Zahidi refers to as Blue Bead Hole remains an intriguing dive site here on Sint Eustatius, where remnants of these beads can still be found today. The underwater site offers us a unique glimpse into the journey of these beads as they traveled across oceans and through time. As we continue tracing their path, we now turn to Mr. Richardson, the Island Heritage Inspector. He will guide us further into understanding how these blue beads were first crafted in European factories, then carried along global trade routes, and ultimately becoming an integral part to everyday life for the enslaved community here on Sint Eustatius, and how they continued to hold meaning well beyond their material worth.
We know, of course, the whole story of them being produced in the Netherlands. I've seen some of the factories even still exist. One factory that many people maybe do not notice, but the Muntplein in Amsterdam, in the cellar of that building on the Muntplein in Amsterdam was actually one of the factories where these beads were produced. So it's quite interesting that that is completely intact and has a different purpose today. And of course, the beads' origin were made as decorations in the yard. They were hung in trees, etc. But they then trickled their way down, of course, into our island, where they became really a commodity in trading, especially for enslaved people. If you go as early back as, for example, the Egyptians, present-day Iran, Persia, there was always bead trading in beads. We know the history of even quite modern Manhattan being traded for a few beads by the Dutch. There was trading in beads before money became something.
The story of Manhattan's so-called purchase with a handful of beads is one of those legends that completely oversimplifies a far more complex historical reality. In 1626, when Peter Minuit, acting for the Dutch West Indian Company, arranged an exchange with the native indigenous Lenape people, the offer reportedly included items, such as blue beads, worth about 60 guilders at the time. Yet, modern scholars suggest that the Lenape people likely understood this arrangement quite differently than the Europeans did, as their concept of land use did not align with European notions of permanent ownership. This account, reducing a nuanced negotiation to a simple story of Europeans outsmarting supposedly, quote-unquote, naive native indigenous people, highlights once again how easily cultural complexities can be lost in translation over time. It mirrors the misunderstandings and the imposed narratives that often overshadows the intricate economies of the past. Much like the blue beads here on St. Eustatius, the Manhattan legend challenges our modern assumption. It reminds us that value is never fixed. It's molded by perspective, purpose, and circumstances. With this in mind, we return to Mr. Richardson's insight into St. Eustatius, where these rare cobalt blue beads, once part of a vast trade of networks, became woven into the fabric of the island's enslaved community, transforming from imported trinkets into tokens of commerce and identity.
What is interesting, though, is that these blue beads, it trickles down into St. Eustatius. And the earliest record of blue beads that I saw on St. Eustatius, where it's noted in a government document then of a ship bringing in blue beads, is one of the ship logs of 1710. You see there's a ship coming in from Amsterdam that had a stop also in Haarlem. And on its way, it also stops in a port in present-day Belgium. And you see it's making these small little stops along the European coast before it descends straight into the Atlantic. And it sails all the way to St. Eustatius. And one of the largest things on the ship log that's extracted from the ship and brought onto the island, blue glass beads in tonnage. So that means amount of weight, etc., that these beads were. And they're being brought into the island, and it says for trade. What's interesting is, of course, fast forwarding from 1710 onwards, you see that the blue beads are becoming more and more prominent on St. Eustatius, but not actually between the Dutch and external traders like the French, but more within the enslaved community. And then you see that the blue beads from around 1710, that it's actually intertwined into the community so far that many people think it's more of an oral tradition, but it was actually kind of, dictated to in the sense of the free people of color, but also the enslaved people of color amongst themselves started to also trade. So, of course, above you had the general economy of trade going on. And then below that, you had amongst the enslaved people also the trade that's going on. And I think that's also quite interesting because it's not really often expounded upon enough what exactly society of the enslaved people, what it was like for them. So you see that the blue beads started to become kind of traded among, and then you see from earlier records that for 3 fishes, you get 2 blue beads in one of the letters from the governor, but you also see that indeed you needed enough beads to put around your waist in order to be married. But then I tend to think that maybe in that description that it's kind of lost in translation, because in African cultures it was normal to have beads around your waist as well. So there's a lot of these things that you see popping up in different research. But I think seeing that beads were also part of African culture before people were enslaved, I think it was also only natural that the enslaved people kind of use that as a kind of way to barter and trade amongst each other. And again, goes back to what I said in the beginning of taking things out of Africa, but taking especially memory with you out of Africa.
With Mr. Richardson's explanation, it becomes clear that the blue beads were far more than a simple form of currency. Instead, they were deeply woven into the social fabric of the enslaved community, reflecting cultural traditions that predated enslavement in Africa. These small artifacts embodied identity, memory, and resilience, connecting distant homeland with everyday life here on the island. To better understand how these vibrant traditions emerged and evolved, we turn again to the archaeologist Dr. Zahidi as she offers valuable insights into the historical significance and cultural depths of the blue beads.
Before Europeans colonized West Africa, there was already an intricate and advanced barter system that was used by different communities and kingdoms. So when Europeans arrived, they realized there was already a complex economic system in place where many different types of objects were being traded, and among those objects were beads. And they exploited that knowledge of the value of beads for different ethnic groups in West Africa and brought that to the Caribbean with the people that they enslaved. So different types of beads symbolize different things. Cowrie shells, for example, they symbolize wealth, power, fertility, protection. And often cowrie shells were passed down over many generations across different kingdoms and ethnic groups. Certain colors were also significant. So in particular, cobalt blue, like the ones that we find in Statia, those types of that color of bead were associated with elite status and the heavens or the celestial bodies. So this bartering economy was based on traditional economic systems in West Africa, but when it was brought to the Caribbean, it prevented enslaved people from participating in the wider economy of the island. So instead of paying people directly for their labor and skills, they were given the beads. This prevented them from using their skills to build capital. For example, on other islands where enslaved people were paid, they could use the money that they received from their expertise, whether that was blacksmithing, tailoring, ship salvage, whatever. They used that money to purchase things. Sometimes they even used it to purchase their own freedom. So those abilities were restricted on Statia because of colonial structures like the blue bead economy. And this is just one example of how colonists exploited West African systems for their own benefit, and then that was transplanted into the Caribbean.
As Dr. Zahidi explains, the blue beads reflect a complex history, one that began in the intricate barter system of West Africa. These beads carry deep cultural meaning symbolizing status, protection, and even celestial connections. Yet, once brought to the Caribbean by colonizers, these beads became tools of exploitation, replacing wages and restricting economic opportunities for enslaved individuals. But the story of these beads doesn't stop here. Their journey extends far beyond Eustatius, revealing connections that span continents and generations. To trace this broader movement, we once again turn to Mr. Richardson as he explores how blue beads first came to Statia, traveled across the Caribbean, and beyond.
What's also very interesting is that they weren't found anywhere else. They're not found on any other Dutch colony. They're found maybe in very little quantities, and if they're found in a Dutch colony, it's because they were enslaved people from St. Eustatius that ended up there or prior or after emancipation. To give you an example, there's a plantation in Suriname where blue beads from St. Eustatius was found. But when you look at the year when the plantation came into existence and you go into the slave records of Suriname, you see that for at one point, maybe 40 enslaved people were transported from St. Eustatius to Suriname. If you look at former Dutch colonies like Tobago, you don't find any blue beads there, but you also don't find the exchange of enslaved people between that island and the Dutch islands. So it's quite interesting. You only find them where the enslaved people were living and where the Dutch were trading. So if you go to Brazil again, there's a small quantity that would have been found there in archaeological sites of former plantations in Olinda. But what you see is when you look in the records, you will see that there's always some kind of direct link to the island of St. Eustatius. So the bees were really traveling with people off island as well, especially the enslaved.
As we conclude this episode and this chapter in time, the years between 1650 and 1700s have revealed how a simple object, like the blue bead, holds stories far greater than its form. Woven into the lives of the enslaved communities here on St. Eustatius, these tiny artifacts remind us of resilience, identity, and survival. bridging a distant homelands with the life here on the island. In tracing their journey, we've once again shed light on a darker side of history, confronting truths that are painful and necessary. Within these stories, we also find strength and the enduring power of memory and culture to adapt, persist, and empower those who carry them forward. As we close this episode, we prepare to move into our next chapter, where the years between 1700 and 1750 bring an even more chaotic period here on Eustatius. As the island grows even busier, its role in the Caribbean trade intensifies. As we step away from this moment, let the whispers of the past continue to resonate, illuminating both the shadows of its history and the resilience of those who lived it.